My cousin demands that I pay her child support because I am childless. My cousin Sloan demanded I pay her $600 monthly as child support for her son Micah because I didn't have children of my own and therefore owed financial support to the family members who did. She actually called it a childless tax and said, since I'd selfishly chosen not to reproduce, I was obligated to financially support the people who were continuing the family line. She created an official-looking document titled Extended Family Child Support Agreement for Non-Parents and tried to make me sign it at Thanksgiving dinner in front of the whole family. She said men without children had been getting away with not contributing to the next generation for too long, and it was time childless uncles paid their fair share. Sloan calculated that I should owe her $600 monthly plus back pay from when Micah was born 7 years ago, which she said totaled $50,400 in unpaid child support. She actually said she could take me to family court for abandoning my financial duties to Micah, and any judge would side with an exhausted mother over a selfish childless man hoarding money in an apartment with nobody in it. She told everyone at dinner that I'd been freeloading off the family by not having kids while expecting to enjoy access to Micah without paying for his upbringing. She said childless people who wanted relationships with the children in the family needed to pay child support just like divorced parents did. When I laughed and said that wasn't how child support worked, Sloan said I was discriminating against parents, and this was exactly the kind of entitlement childless people showed when they refused to support the kids in their lives. She said Micah was basically my part-time son since I had him every single weekend and took him places, so I owed partial financial support for his existence. She actually said she had produced the next generation of this family on my behalf since I'd refused to do it myself, and people who outsource production pay the manufacturer. She reminded me that she made me Micah's godfather at his christening 7 years ago, and she said that title came with a monthly rate I'd been dodging since the day I accepted it. She threatened to ban me from seeing Micah unless I started paying monthly child support immediately. Sloan had spent $9,400 that year building a momfluencer brand, a photographer, a branding course from a woman she'd never met, a studio lighting kit, and a wardrobe she only ever wore for pictures, but claimed she couldn't afford Micah's soccer cleats without my financial assistance. She said raising children was expensive, and childless people needed to understand their privilege of having disposable income came with responsibilities to the family's children. She actually sent me invoices for half of Micah's expenses, including his haircuts, his cleats, and even his snacks, saying this was my portion of shared custody costs. She itemized a bag of pretzels. She told Micah I was his money uncle who was supposed to pay for things, but was being stingy with money that rightfully belonged to him. That's when I decided Sloan needed to learn what paying support actually meant. I started by creating my own invoices for all the babysitting I'd done over 7 years at the going rate of $25 per hour. I calculated that Sloan owed me $36,000 for unpaid child care services that she'd been freeloading off while claiming I didn't contribute. I sent her an official-looking document titled Family Child Care Services Past Due and demanded immediate payment for my labor that she'd been taking for free. When Sloan said family didn't charge for babysitting, I said family didn't charge child support either, but here we were with her new rules. Next, I started demanding Sloan pay me support for everything I'd given up to be available for Micah. I billed her for missed career opportunities when I'd taken time off to watch him, lost income from leaving work early for his school events, and emotional labor compensation for dealing with his meltdowns. I created spreadsheets showing she owed me $600 monthly in lifestyle support for the sacrifices I'd made to be an involved uncle. I told our family that Sloan had been exploiting my free labor for years while contributing nothing to my life in return. For Christmas, I gave Sloan an invoice for 7 years of gifts I'd bought Micah, saying if she wanted child support, then she needed to reimburse me for all the voluntary contributions I'd already made. I included every birthday present, Christmas gift, random toy, and ice cream cone I'd ever bought him with interest calculated at credit card rates. The total came to $18,000 that Sloan owed me for gifts she'd accepted without payment. I told her she couldn't have it both ways, demanding future support while keeping past contributions. Then I remembered something that made me sit down at my kitchen table and go very quiet for about 10 minutes. Every single photograph on Sloan's momfluencer account was a photograph I had taken. I'm the one with the camera at every birthday and every soccer game and every Christmas morning, and I'd been handing her the files for free for 7 years because that is what family does. She'd built an entire monetized brand out of my pictures of her son. So I made one more invoice. 210 images at a licensing rate of $150 per image for commercial use on a monetized account, which came to $31,500. And at the bottom, I noted that the rate would double for any image still posted after 30 days. I mailed it certified so she'd have to sign for it, because she'd taught me that the paperwork only counts when it looks official. The real justice came when I started telling everyone that Sloan was charging me to see Micah like he was a rental kid. I explained to our aunts, our uncles, our grandmother, and her own friends that Sloan had created a pay-to-play system where family members members had to pay monthly fees to have a relationship with a 7-year-old. People were horrified that she was essentially selling access to her child and treating him like a subscription service. Her husband found out about the child support demands and was mortified that Sloan was trying to extort money from me using their son. Grant grabbed Sloan's arm right there in my aunt's kitchen and pulled her toward the hallway where they thought nobody could hear them. His face looked like a tomato, and the vein in his forehead was sticking out like it does when he's really mad. Sloan tried to yank her arm away, but Grant held on tight and whispered something sharp that made her eyes go wide. I pretended to help my aunt clear the dessert plates while everyone else suddenly found their phones super interesting or started talking really loud about the weather. Through the doorway, I could see Sloan waving her hands around, trying to explain herself, but Grant kept shaking his head and pointing toward the front door. She said something back that made him close his eyes like he was counting to 10. Then he said something that made her face go pale. They came back into the dining room and Sloan wouldn't look at anyone, while Grant told my aunt and uncle they needed to leave right away because something came up. Aunt Renata looked worried and asked if everything was okay, but Grant just grabbed their coats and practically pushed Sloan out the door without even saying goodbye to Micah properly. My phone rang at 8 the next morning, and Grant's name popped up on the screen. His voice sounded rough, like he'd been awake all night and maybe crying a little. He said he was so sorry about what Sloan tried to do, and he swore on everything that he had no idea she'd been planning this crazy child support thing. He told me he stayed up until 4 in the morning going through every bank statement and credit card bill they had after I left Thanksgiving dinner. That's when he found the $9,400 in charges for a photographer, a branding course, a lighting kit, and an entire wardrobe from stores he had never once seen a shopping bag from in his own house. He said Sloan told him those charges were for Micah's school expenses and new winter clothes, but now he knew she'd been lying straight to his face for months. His voice cracked when he asked if I could send him copies of all those invoices I made, because he needed to see exactly what Sloan had been doing behind his back. I told him I'd email everything over within an hour, and he thanked me about 5 times before hanging up. 2 days later, I met Grant at the coffee shop near his office during his lunch break. He looked terrible with dark circles under his eyes, and his shirt wasn't even ironed right. I brought my laptop and pulled up all the spreadsheets I'd created showing 7 years of babysitting at $25 per hour, every birthday present and Christmas gift with receipts, all the times I left work early to pick up Micah from school, and the complete timeline of Sloan's demands starting from that first text message 3 months ago. Grant's hands actually shook when he scrolled through the numbers adding up to over $54,000 of free childcare and gifts and photography I'd given them. He kept zooming in on the dates of Sloan's branding purchases compared to the times she texted me saying they couldn't afford Micah's field trip fees or new cleats. He admitted he'd been picking up overnight freight shifts at the distribution center for the past year because Sloan kept saying they were barely making ends meet and needed more money coming in. Now he realized all that extra money he earned at 3 in the morning went straight into a ring light and a rented backdrop instead of their son's needs or their savings account. He put his head in his hands and said he felt like such an idiot for not seeing what was happening right under his nose. Then he pulled out his phone and opened Sloan's account and stared at the top photo for a long time without saying anything. He said it was my light, and I'd taken that picture at his own son's birthday party while he was out in the yard flipping burgers for 30 people, and he'd never once been in a single frame of the brand his wife built out of his family. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I was making dinner in my apartment when someone started pounding on my door, hard enough to make my neighbor's dog start barking. I looked through the peephole and saw Sloan standing there with her arms crossed and her face all red and angry. I opened the door, and she pushed past me into my living room without even being invited in. She started yelling about how I was trying to destroy her marriage by showing Grant private information and turning her own husband against her. I stayed calm and told her those invoices weren't private since she'd sent me official-looking documents first. So, I just responded with my own official-looking documents showing what she actually owed me. She screamed that I was being petty and vindictive, and I had no right to go behind her back to Grant. I said I didn't go behind her back at all because Grant called me asking questions, and I simply answered honestly with documentation, just like she'd done to me at Thanksgiving dinner in front of the whole family. She got right in my face and said if her marriage fell apart, it would be all my fault for being a selfish little man who couldn't just help out his own family. I looked her dead in the eye and said if showing her husband the same invoices she sent me was destroying her marriage, then maybe the problem wasn't me, but the lies she'd been telling him for months. She stopped talking for about 4 seconds, and then she said the licensing invoice was insane because those were pictures of her son. I told her that was exactly right. They were pictures of her son, taken by me, on my camera, on my weekends, posted on her monetized account, and if family sends each other bills now, then family sends each other bills. She told me I was being ridiculous because that was different. I asked her to explain what was different about it, and she stood in my living room with her mouth open for a long moment, and then she left without answering, and she slammed my door hard enough that the picture in my hallway went crooked. It was a picture of her son. That afternoon, Aunt Renata called me crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying at first. She finally calmed down enough to tell me Sloan had showed up at her house an hour ago, claiming I was trying to steal Micah away from her by poisoning Grant's mind with lies. Renata said Sloan kept saying I was jealous of her perfect family and trying to break it up because I was a bitter, childless man who wanted to ruin everyone else's happiness. Renata admitted she didn't know what to believe at first because Sloan seemed so upset and so convinced, but then she remembered that crazy child support document from Thanksgiving and realized Sloan wasn't making any sense. She said she loved her daughter and she loved her nephew, but Sloan's demand for child support was completely out of line and she couldn't support that kind of behavior no matter what. I explained to Renata that I wasn't trying to take Micah anywhere or break up Sloan's marriage. I was just refusing to pay money I didn't owe and showing Grant the truth when he asked for it. I told her Sloan's marriage problems were her own fault for lying about money and trying to extort family members, and those were consequences of Sloan's choices, not mine. Renata got quiet, and then she said something that stayed with me for weeks. She said she'd been paying Sloan's bills quietly for 4 years, and she'd never told Uncle Dale about any of it, and she was starting to wonder if she'd been the one who taught her daughter that somebody else always covers it. My phone buzzed with a text from Sloan later that week that was so nasty, I had to read it twice to believe she actually sent it. She wrote that I was banned from seeing Micah until I apologized for destroying her marriage and agreed to pay at least $250 monthly in uncle support as a compromise. She said if I really loved that boy, I'd be willing to help support him financially, instead of being a greedy little man hoarding my money in an empty apartment. She called me selfish about 10 times in one paragraph and said Micah deserved better than an uncle who valued money over family. I took a screenshot of the whole message and forwarded it straight to Grant without adding any comment of my own. He texted back in less than 5 minutes saying Sloan didn't get to decide who saw Micah by herself, and she definitely couldn't ban me from that boy's life over refusing to pay made-up fees. He said he was planning to bring Micah to visit me this Saturday, no matter what Sloan said, because I was family, and Micah loved spending time with me. Saturday morning, Grant showed up at my apartment with Micah, who ran inside and gave me a big hug like always. But then he pulled back and looked up at me with these sad, confused eyes and asked why Mommy kept saying I didn't want to help take care of him anymore. My stomach dropped, and I felt sick, realizing Sloan had been telling Micah that I was abandoning him. I knelt down so we were eye level and told him I loved him more than anything, and I would always be his uncle no matter what. I explained that grown-ups don't charge each other money to be family because that's not how love works, and Mommy had gotten confused about how family relationships are supposed to work. I said sometimes adults make mistakes and say things that aren't true when they're upset, but none of this was his fault, and nothing would ever change how much I cared about him. He hugged me again and seemed to feel better, then asked if we could go to the park like we used to. I took Micah to the park down the street while Grant stayed at my apartment to make some phone calls. We sat on the swings and Micah started talking about how Mommy and Daddy had been fighting a lot at home lately. He said he could hear them arguing at night after he went to bed, and it scared him because they never used to fight like that before. He told me Mommy kept saying I was selfish and mean, but he didn't understand why because I'd always been nice to him and took him fun places and bought him ice cream. Then he said something that put a rock in my chest and left it there for the rest of the winter. He said he was tired of taking pictures. He said Mommy made him change his shirt 4 times last Saturday and stand by the window and smile again and again until she got one she liked, and that he wasn't allowed to eat the pancakes in the pancake picture because they had to stay perfect for the next one. He said he liked it better when I took pictures because I never made him stand still and I let him be blurry. I pushed his swing gently and promised him that the grown-ups were working through some problems that had nothing to do with him and weren't his responsibility to fix. I told him that no matter what happened between the grown-ups, I would always love him and want to spend time with him because he was my favorite kid in the whole world. He smiled a little at that and said I was his favorite uncle, which made sense since I was his only uncle, and we both laughed. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, this woman named Becca said she was Sloan's best friend, and she really needed to talk to me about everything that had been going on. We agreed to meet for lunch at this sandwich place halfway between our apartments. Becca seemed nervous when she sat down and started by saying she'd heard Sloan's side of the story, but she'd also talked to Aunt Renata and some other family members, and now she was really concerned about Sloan. She admitted that Sloan had been complaining to her for months about this childless tax idea, but Becca thought it was just venting about feeling stressed with money. Becca leaned forward and told me things about Sloan that I didn't know. She said Sloan had been spending hours every day on social media comparing herself to other mothers who seemed to have perfect lives and perfect families and perfect kitchens. Becca said Sloan had borrowed money from her and at least 2 other friends over the past year, always claiming Grant was being cheap with the household money and that she needed help covering basic expenses for Micah. But now Becca realized Sloan had been lying about their financial situation the whole time and using borrowed money to fund her image instead of her son's needs. Then Becca said the thing that made me put my sandwich down. She said the brand deals Sloan bragged about at every family dinner weren't real. Sloan had been buying the products herself and writing the posts herself and tagging companies that had never once contacted her, and she'd bought about 11,000 followers from a service that Becca found open on Sloan's laptop while they were looking up a recipe. Becca looked really sad when she said she loved Sloan like a sister, but she couldn't support her trying to extort family members for money. And she honestly thought Sloan needed professional help to deal with her spending and her warped sense of entitlement about what other people owed her. After we finished lunch, I sat in my car for a while thinking about everything Becca had said about the fake brand deals and the borrowed money and the 11,000 people who didn't exist. It made me sad to realize my cousin had gotten so lost comparing herself to fake perfect lives online that she'd built a fake perfect life of her own and then sent the bill for it to me. But I also knew that wasn't my problem to fix, and Sloan needed to face the consequences of her choices before she'd ever change. The first Sunday in December rolled around, and Aunt Renata hosted the regular family dinner like she did every week. I showed up with a casserole dish wondering if Sloan would even be there or if she'd skipped to avoid seeing me. She came with Grant and Micah, but the second she walked in and saw me setting food on the dining room table, her whole face changed. She grabbed a chair at the far end of the table as far from me as possible and made sure Micah sat between her and Grant like she needed a buffer. Throughout dinner, she kept making these pointed comments about how some people cared more about money than family bonds and how selfish individuals always put themselves first. She said it was sad when people forgot that family was supposed to support each other through hard times instead of keeping score. Aunt Renata tried to change the subject by asking Micah about school, but Sloan just kept going, saying out loud to no one in particular that she couldn't believe how cold some people could be to their own blood. Uncle Dale set his fork down hard enough that it clanked against his plate and everyone went quiet. He looked directly at Sloan and said she needed to stop playing the victim right now because she was the one who made this whole situation about money by demanding I pay her child support. His voice was firm and tired at the same time as he told her she'd created this mess with her ridiculous demands and her manipulation, and now she needed to take responsibility instead of acting like everyone else was the problem. Sloan's mouth dropped open like she couldn't believe her own father was calling her out in front of everyone. She started to say something, but Dale held up his hand and said he wasn't finished talking. He told Sloan that her behavior toward me had been cruel and unfair, and he was done watching her try to guilt-trip me for having boundaries. The tension in the room got so thick I could barely breathe, and then Micah started crying at the table because the adults were fighting. Grant immediately stood up and took Micah outside to the backyard, while the rest of us sat there in awful silence. Aunt Renata reached over and put her hand on Sloan's arm and said they needed to have an honest conversation about what had been happening. Her voice was shaky but determined, as she admitted she'd been enabling Sloan's victim mentality for years because it was easier than confronting her. She said watching Sloan try to manipulate me and poison Micah against me had finally opened her eyes to how unhealthy the family dynamics had become. Renata looked right at Sloan and told her that the child support demand was ridiculous, that her treatment of me had been cruel, and that she needed to take responsibility for her choices instead of blaming everyone else for her problems. She said Sloan's spending habits and entitlement issues were hers to deal with, and the family couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Then Renata said the 4 years of quiet payments were over too, and Uncle Dale's head turned toward his wife so fast I heard his neck crack, because that was the first he'd ever heard of it. Sloan's face went red and then white, and she pushed her chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. She started yelling that the whole family had turned against her and taken my side without even trying to understand her perspective. She stomped toward the back door, calling for Grant and Micah and saying they were leaving right now. Grant came back inside looking exhausted and defeated and gathered up Micah's jacket without saying anything. Sloan was already out the front door screaming back at us that we'd all chosen sides and destroyed this family. The door slammed and we heard their car start up and drive away. Aunt Renata put her face in her hands and started crying these quiet sobs that made her whole body shake. Uncle Dale moved his chair closer and wrapped his arms around her, and they just sat there holding each other, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen them look before. I felt this heavy guilt settling in my chest. Even though I knew logically that I hadn't started this conflict and I hadn't demanded anything unreasonable, Sloan had created this whole mess, but somehow I still felt responsible for my aunt and uncle sitting there crying and my family falling apart on a Sunday over a casserole nobody touched. Around 11 that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Grant saying Sloan had locked herself in their bedroom the second they got home and wouldn't speak to him or come out. He said he'd tried talking to her through the door, but she just kept yelling that everyone hated her and nobody understood what she was going through. His text said he'd reached his breaking point with her refusal to acknowledge reality or take accountability for anything she'd done. He wrote that he was going to insist on counseling and financial counseling, and if Sloan wouldn't agree to both, then he was prepared to separate because he couldn't raise Micah in an environment full of manipulation and manufactured drama. He said he was sorry for everything Sloan had put me through, and he hoped our family could eventually heal from all this damage. I texted back thanking him for being reasonable and telling him I hoped things would work out, but that I understood if he needed to make hard choices to protect himself and Micah. The middle of December came, and Sloan made the choice that ended the whole argument forever, although at the time she thought she was winning it. She posted a video. It was 11 minutes long, and she was crying in very good lighting, with Micah's framed framed school photo positioned carefully over her left shoulder. She said she wanted to be vulnerable with her community about something heartbreaking that had been happening in her family. Then she told 43,000 followers that her own cousin, a childless man with no responsibilities and a nice apartment, had abandoned her little boy and refused to help a struggling mother who was drowning. She said she'd asked her family for help and been sent a bill instead. She said some people in this world simply choose money over children, and there was nothing you could do but pray for them. She never used my name, but she used the town, and she used my job, and she used a photo of my own hands holding Micah as a newborn, with my face cropped out of the top of the frame. I had taken that photo on a timer in a hospital hallway at 2 a.m. She asked her community to remind her that not everyone in the world is like that. Aunt Renata called me within 20 minutes and read me the comments out loud while I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet door. She asked me how I could just sit there and take it. I told her Sloan had spent 3 months building a case out of documents, and now she'd put the entire thing in writing in front of 43,000 witnesses, and the only thing I needed to do was absolutely nothing at all. It took about 19 hours. The first comment that mattered came from a woman who asked why a mother drowning in bills was filming in front of a brand new marble backsplash. Then somebody else spotted the handbag on the shelf behind her head and priced it in the replies to 3 decimal places. Then a woman who'd taken the exact same branding course recognized the ring light in the reflection of Sloan's eyes and named the package and named the cost. Somebody found the photographer's account and found the post where the photographer publicly thanked Sloan for the booking, dated 11 days after Sloan had texted me that she couldn't cover a $40 field trip. It went from 100 supportive comments to 900 comments in one afternoon and to 4,000 by the next morning. People started asking why every single photo on the account was shot in a completely different style than the video, which was a very polite way of saying that somebody else had taken all of them. Then 3 separate strangers asked the question that actually finished her, which was whether the little boy in all these pictures had ever agreed to any of it. Becca sent me a screenshot at 6 a.m. of Sloan's account with the video deleted and the comments turned off on every single post going back 4 years. Sloan called me 11 times that day, and I didn't answer once. She told 43,000 people that I was the kind of man who sends bills instead of help, and I sat there with my phone buzzing, and I decided that the only honest thing left to do was be exactly the man she had described. The 30 days on my licensing invoice ran out on the 18th of December. I want to be very clear about something, because I thought about it for 4 days, and I barely slept for 2 of them. I wasn't angry when I did it. I'd been angry in November, when she slid that document across the Thanksgiving table with everyone watching, and I'd been angry when she billed me for a 7-year-old's pretzels. I finally understood what she'd actually been doing for 7 years, which was taking things that were not hers and calling it family. Every photograph on that account was mine. I took them on my camera with my hands, on my weekends, at my own expense, at every birthday and every game and every Christmas morning since he was born, and I handed them over for free 210 times because I love that boy and because that is what you do. She turned them into a business. She turned them into a persona. She turned them into a fundraising story about a struggling mother, and then she used that story to try to move $400 out of my bank account and into hers. So on the 18th of December, I sat down at my kitchen table at 7 in the evening and I filed the paperwork on every single image. Not a lawsuit, not a threat, just a copyright claim on my own photographs, filed through the platform one at a time for 4 hours and 20 minutes, with the original camera files and the timestamps and the raw metadata attached to each one, because I had every single original and she had never once asked me for them. I didn't message Sloan about it. I didn't tell the family. I didn't post anything. I just did the paperwork, exactly the way she had spent 3 months teaching me to do it, and then I made myself dinner and went to bed. The account came down in pieces over 3 days, which was somehow worse than if it had all gone at once. On the first day, the top 11 posts vanished, which were the ones carrying the entire grid, the Christmas morning set and the beach set and the one of Micah in his cleats with grass on his knee that had 30,000 likes on it. On the second day, the account went from 410 posts down to 61. Becca said the 61 that survived were all selfies and mirror shots and pictures of coffee because those were the only photographs in 7 years that Sloan had ever actually taken herself. On the third day, the profile picture went too, because that one was mine as well, and the account just sat there with a gray circle where her face used to be, and a bio that still said family first in cursive, and a grid with almost nothing left in it. 43,000 people were looking at an empty room. The brand she'd spent $9,400 and 4 years building was gone in 72 hours, and it was gone because none of it had ever actually belonged to her, and every single person who looked at that page could see it now without me having to say one word in my own defense. She had spent 3 months arguing that the things I gave for free were things she was owed. The claim went through in an afternoon because a machine read the metadata and disagreed with her. The week before Christmas, Grant showed up at my aunt and uncle's house with Micah and 2 suitcases, asking if they could stay in the guest room for a while. Grant explained explained that he'd told Sloan he was moving out temporarily until she agreed to get professional help, and Sloan had completely lost it. He said the reason he finally packed the bag wasn't the money, and it wasn't the video, and it wasn't even the lying. He said he walked past Micah's room the night the account came down and heard his son crying into a pillow, and when he went in and asked what was wrong, Micah asked him whether it was his fault that Mommy's pictures were gone. Within an hour of them arriving, my phone started ringing with Sloan's number. I answered, and she immediately started screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She yelled that I'd destroyed her family and stolen her husband and her son and erased 7 years of her life in 3 days. I stayed calm and told her that Grant had made his own choice based on her behavior and not anything I'd done. I told her I hadn't erased 7 years of her life. I'd taken back 7 years of mine. I said she was welcome to fix her marriage anytime she wanted by actually addressing her spending and her entitlement instead of blaming everyone else for the consequences of her own actions. She called me every horrible name she could think of, and then she hung up on me. Christmas Eve arrived, and I was at my aunt and uncle's house helping Renata set up for our small celebration when the doorbell rang. Uncle Dale went to answer it, and there was Sloan on the front porch demanding to see Micah. Her voice carried through the whole house as she said we were all guilty of parental alienation, and she was going to call the police if we didn't let her see her son immediately. Dale stood firm in the doorway, blocking her from coming inside, and told her in a steady voice that she was absolutely welcome to visit Micah, but not if she was going to create a scene or say bad things about family members in front of her own son. Sloan stood on that porch in the cold and told her own father that he'd chosen a childless nephew over his only grandson's mother. Dale looked at her for a long moment and said no, he'd chosen his grandson, and she should go home tonight and think very hard about why those two things had turned out to be different. Micah brought her a cookie he'd decorated with about 9 pounds of sprinkles on it. She took a picture of it out of pure reflex, the way you'd swat at a fly. Then she looked down at the phone in her hand, and she looked at the app that had nothing left in it, and she put the phone face down on the couch cushion like it had burned her, and she ate the cookie. 2 days after Christmas, Becca called and asked if she could come by, and when she got to my apartment, she didn't take her coat off and she didn't sit down. She handed me her phone. It was a group chat between Sloan and 2 other women from her branding course, and Becca had scrolled all the way back to a conversation from August, 4 months before Thanksgiving. Sloan had posted a picture of Micah asleep on my shoulder at a family barbecue, a picture I had taken and handed her that same night. And Sloan wrote back that the moment was fine, but the numbers were better, that this kind of shot was her highest performing content by a mile, and that she was going to start scheduling more of them into the calendar for the fall. Content. She called her sleeping son content, and then she called him a calendar item. I kept scrolling with my thumb, and it got worse, because a few messages down she'd written that her cousin was the free photographer and the free babysitter and the free everything, and that the only real problem with me was that I didn't come with a monthly line item yet, but she was working on that. She wrote that in August. She wrote it 4 months before she slid a child support agreement across a Thanksgiving table in front of every person who raised her, which meant it was never a bad month. It was a plan. She'd sat down at some point during the summer with a cup of coffee and looked at her own sleeping child and looked at the man who took the picture of him, and she had worked out how to turn both of us into a monthly line item. I stood in my kitchen for about 20 minutes after she left, holding my own phone, looking at the last photo I ever took of that boy. I didn't feel angry, and I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt tired in a way I hadn't felt in 7 years, because I'd finally learned what it weighs to find out that every free thing you ever handed somebody was counted, valued, and entered into a spreadsheet by a person who called you family while they did it. New Year's Day, Aunt Renata hosted dinner and told everyone to come at 2 Kai, and she called Sloan herself and told her she was expected there. Sloan came alone, because Grant and Micah were still upstairs in the guest room, and nobody at that table pretended otherwise. She sat down looking smaller than I had ever seen her look, in a plain gray sweater, hair pulled back flat, no makeup, no phone anywhere in her hands. And then Aunt Renata put down her napkin, stood up, walked to the sideboard, and came back with a manila envelope and set it on the table in front of her daughter. Sloan looked at it and asked what it was. Renata sat back down, put her napkin in her lap, and said it was an invoice. The room went completely silent. Sloan opened it with shaking hands, and I watched my cousin's face while she read it. And I am going to be honest with you. It was the first time in 3 months that I felt anything other than exhausted. The document was titled Extended Family Mothering Services Past Due. It was 4 pages long, 34 years, every night feeding for the first 2 years at an hourly rate. 4 years of tuition, the wedding, the $6,000 for the down payment on the house that Sloan never paid back and that Renata had never once mentioned to a living soul, not even to her own husband, for 4 years. All of it calculated at Sloan's own rate of $600 a month, with the exact same back pay structure Sloan had used on me, with the exact same credit card interest that Sloan had accepted without complaint the entire time she believed the bill belonged to somebody else. The total at the bottom of the 4th page was in bold. It was $412,800. Sloan put the pages down on the tablecloth and said in this small, small, cracked voice that family doesn't charge each other for that. And Aunt Renata looked across the table at the daughter she had been feeding at it for 34 years, and she said, "Family doesn't charge for babysitting either, sweetheart, but here we are, with your new rules." Then she picked up her fork and asked Uncle Dale to pass the potatoes.